The gate agent's voice cut through the busy airport terminal like a blade. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but your ticket shows invalid. You cannot board this flight." The elderly woman in the worn cardigan stood frozen, clutching her small carry-on bag, as hundreds of passengers flowed around her like water around a stone. Gate 12 was buzzing with the usual chaos of delayed flights and frustrated travelers, but something about this moment felt different. The woman's weathered hands trembled slightly as she reached into her bag, not for another form of ID or credit card, but for something that would change everything. What she pulled out wasn't just a piece of metal and ribbon, it was a testament to courage that most people only read about in history books. And when the air marshal stationed nearby caught sight of what hung from that faded blue ribbon, the entire terminal was about to witness something extraordinary. The fluorescent lights of Gate 12 cast their harsh glow over the sea of travelers, each person absorbed in their own journey, their own destinations. Among them stood Margaret Chen, 78 years old, wearing a simple navy cardigan that had seen better decades and carrying a small, well-worn leather bag. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her posture, despite her age, held a subtle strength that most people overlooked. She approached the gate counter with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far greater challenges than airport bureaucracy. "Next," called the gate agent, a young man in his 20s whose name tag read Derek. His fingers moved impatiently across the keyboard as he barely glanced up at Margaret. She handed him her boarding pass and identification with steady hands, the same hands that had once operated life-saving equipment under enemy fire, though Derek had no way of knowing this. He scanned her documents with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of passengers that day. His expression shifted from boredom to irritation as he stared at his computer screen. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but your ticket shows invalid. You cannot board this flight." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret's eyes, still sharp and clear despite her years, met his with a puzzled expression. Around them, the terminal continued its relentless rhythm of announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried conversations. But something in this moment felt suspended, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," Margaret said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to remaining calm under pressure. "I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago through the airline's website. I have my confirmation number right here." She reached into her bag, her movements deliberate and unhurried, pulling out a printed confirmation email that she had folded carefully and stored in the front pocket. The paper showed signs of being handled multiple times, as if she had checked and rechecked her travel documents with military precision. Derek barely glanced at the printout, his attention already shifting to the growing line behind her. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but the computer system is clear. Your reservation was canceled due to payment issues. There's nothing I can do from here. You'll need to go to the main ticket counter and resolve this with customer service." His tone carried the dismissive edge of bureaucratic finality, the kind that suggested he had delivered similar news countless times before and had long since stopped caring about the human impact of his words. The passengers behind Margaret began to shift restlessly, checking their watches and phones, their travel anxiety mounting as the boarding process ground to a halt. A businessman in an expensive suit cleared his throat loudly, making his impatience known. A mother with 2 small children looked around nervously, worried about missing their connection. The energy at Gate 12 was becoming increasingly tense, and Margaret found herself at the center of a growing storm of frustrated travelers. "Sir, I've had this same credit card for 15 years, and there have never been any payment issues," Margaret continued, her voice remaining steady despite the rising murmur of complaints from the other passengers. "Could you please check again? Perhaps contact your supervisor?" She maintained her dignity even as she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, some sympathetic, others openly annoyed at the delay she was causing. She had faced hostile crowds before, though in circumstances far more dangerous than an airport gate. Derek's fingers moved across his keyboard with exaggerated irritation, putting on a show of checking the system again while making it clear through his body language that he considered this a waste of time. "Ma'am, I've checked twice now. The system is never wrong about these things. Your payment was declined, your reservation was automatically canceled, and that seat has already been reassigned to someone else. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside so I can help the other passengers. The dismissal hit Margaret like a physical blow, not because of Derek's rudeness, but because of what this flight meant to her. She was traveling to attend a ceremony honoring her fallen comrades, brothers and sisters in arms who had made the ultimate sacrifice in a war most people preferred to forget. Missing this flight would mean missing the memorial service, Filey, known to keep a promise she had made to men and women who could no longer speak for themselves. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like the gear she had once carried through hostile territory. As Margaret stepped slightly to the side, still clutching her boarding pass and confirmation, she became acutely aware of the whispered conversations starting around her. "Just an old lady who probably messed up her booking," she heard someone mutter. Another voice added, "These elderly people shouldn't travel alone if they can't handle the technology." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they reduced her to a stereotype, erasing decades of service and sacrifice with casual dismissal. She had commanded respect in boardrooms and battlefields, had been entrusted with decisions that affected thousands of lives, but here in Gate 12, she was just another confused senior citizen causing delays. Margaret's weathered fingers moved to her small leather bag, not to retrieve another credit card or form of identification, but to touch something that had traveled with her for over 5 decades. The bag had been a gift from her unit before her final deployment, crafted by a leather worker in a small Vietnamese village they had helped rebuild. Inside, wrapped carefully in a piece of silk that had once belonged to her dress uniform, was the reason she had never spoken much about her military service. Some medals were earned through routine duty and good conduct, but others carried the weight of moments that changed the course of battles and saved countless lives. 2 Air Marshals, Agent Sarah Rodriguez and Agent Michael Thompson, had been observing the situation at Gate 12 with the trained awareness that came from years of watching for unusual behavior in airports. They weren't concerned about Margaret causing a security threat, but something about her bearing, the way she carried herself despite the humiliation, had caught their attention. Rodriguez, a former Marine herself, recognized something in the elderly woman's posture that spoke of military training that never fully fades, even decades after service ends. As Margaret carefully withdrew a small blue box from her bag, Thompson's eyes widened. Even from their position 20 feet away, the distinctive ribbon was unmistakable. The light blue silk adorned with 13 white stars caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the terminal, and both air marshals moved closer, their training overridden by a deeper recognition of what they were witnessing. Rodriguez felt her breath catch as she saw the bronze star hanging from that precious ribbon, knowing that fewer than 4,000 people in American history had ever received such recognition. "Excuse me, ma'am," Agent Rodriguez said, approaching Margaret with a respect that was immediately apparent in her voice and posture. The gate area, which had been buzzing with impatient chatter, began to quiet as people sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Derek looked up from his computer, annoyed at yet another interruption to his workflow, but his expression changed when he saw the federal badges that Rodriguez and Thompson displayed discreetly. Margaret looked up at the 2 agents, her eyes holding the weary patience of someone who had explained herself countless times over the years. "Yes, officers," she said, her voice steady but resigned. She had learned long ago that sometimes wearing the medal caused more complications than it solved, drawing attention she had never sought and questions she wasn't always prepared to answer. But today, with the memorial service waiting and her flight status in jeopardy, she was willing to try anything. "Ma'am, is that the Medal of Honor?" Thompson asked, his voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred spaces. The question rippled through the nearby passengers like electricity, and conversations stopped mid-sentence as people began to turn their attention toward the small group at the gate counter. Derek's fingers froze over his keyboard as he began to understand that something significant was happening, though he wasn't yet sure what. Margaret nodded slowly, her hands holding the medal with the care of someone who understood its true weight. "Yes, it is," she said simply, without elaboration or explanation. She had learned over the years that the medal spoke for itself to those who understood its significance and required no justification to those who didn't. The ribbon seemed to glow under the terminal lights, its colors representing not just personal courage, but the sacrifice of every service member who had stood in harm's way for others. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward, and in a gesture that surprised everyone within sight, she rendered a perfect military salute to Margaret. Agent Thompson immediately followed suit, their synchronized movement creating a moment of stunning silence in the busy terminal. Other veterans in the area, recognizing the significance of what was happening, began to stand. A retired Navy captain who had been reading near the gate put down his book and came to attention. A young Army sergeant on leave stood up from his seat, his travel clothes unable to hide his military bearing. The transformation was remarkable and swift. Derek, who moments before had been dismissive and bureaucratic, now stared in stunned silence as he began to comprehend the magnitude of his error. The passengers who had been complaining about delays fell quiet, many of them pulling out their phones not to check flight updates, but to capture what they instinctively understood was a rare and significant moment. The businessman who had been clearing his throat impatiently now stood with his hand over his heart, his expensive suit suddenly seeming trivial in comparison to the simple cardigan worn by the woman before him. Margaret, who had spent decades deflecting attention and avoiding recognition, found herself at the center of something she couldn't control or diminish. The medal she carried wasn't just her own. It represented every medic who had run toward danger instead of away from it, every service member who had put others' lives before their own safety. As more people in the terminal became aware of what was happening, a respectful silence spread outward from Gate 12 like ripples on a pond, creating a sacred space in the midst of commercial chaos. Agent Rodriguez spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the now quiet gate area. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Master Sergeant Margaret Chen, United States Army Medical Corps Medal of Honor recipient. She served 3 tours in Vietnam where she repeatedly risked her life to save wounded soldiers under enemy fire. She is traveling today to honor fallen comrades at a memorial service." The words hung in the air with the WOTA 8 of truth and sacrifice, and Derek realized with dawning horror that he had not just denied boarding to a passenger, but had disrespected a genuine American hero. The gate agent's face went pale as the full impact of his actions became clear. Without hesitation, he began typing rapidly on his computer, his previous efficiency now driven by urgent respect rather than bureaucratic routine. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize," he said, his voice shaky with emotion. "There seems to have been a system error. Your seat is confirmed and I'm upgrading you to first class immediately. We'll board you first and I'll personally ensure your luggage is handled with priority." The transformation in his demeanor was complete, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by the kind of service reserved for dignitaries and heads of state. As Master Sergeant Margaret Chen walked down the jetway toward her flight, the terminal behind her remained unusually quiet, as if the space itself had been changed by what had occurred. Passengers continued to approach the gate agents with their own travel concerns, but there was a different quality to the interactions now, a recognition that every person carries stories and sacrifices that may not be immediately visible. The Medal of Honor had returned to its silk wrapping in Margaret's bag, but its impact on Gate 12 would linger long after her flight departed. The 2 air marshals watched her board, knowing they had witnessed something that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. Agent Rodriguez, thinking of her own military service, felt a renewed sense of purpose in her current role protecting travelers. Agent Thompson made a mental note to call his grandfather, a Korean War veteran, that evening. Around the terminal, other passengers found themselves thinking about their own family members who had served, parents and grandparents whose war stories had become family legends, young relatives currently deployed overseas. Derek spent the rest of his shift with a different perspective on his job, understanding for the first time that he wasn't just processing tickets and managing logistics, but serving people whose life experiences spanned the full spectrum of human courage and sacrifice. He would tell the story of Master Sergeant Chen to his own children someday, ensuring that her dignity in the face of his dismissal became a lesson about looking deeper than surface appearances and treating every person with the respect their unknown story might deserve. Margaret's flight took off on time, carrying her toward a ceremony where she would stand with other aging veterans to honor friends who would never grow old. The medal in her bag would remain mostly hidden, as it had for decades, but its brief appearance at Gate 12 had served as a reminder that heroes often walk among us unrecognized, carrying their service quietly and without expectation of special treatment. They ask only for the same basic respect and dignity accorded to all people, though they have earned so much more. The stories of our military heroes deserve to be told and retold, not just in history books and documentaries, but in the everyday moments when we encounter the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. Master Sergeant Margaret Chen's experience. He reminds us to look beyond appearances, to treat each person we meet with dignity, and to remember that the person standing in line ahead of us, sitting in the next airplane seat, or asking for our help might be someone whose courage once changed the world. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more accounts of unsung heroes whose service and sacrifice have shaped our freedom. Share this video to honor all veterans who carry their medals not on their chests, but in their hearts, and help us ensure that their stories continue to inspire future generations. Because every hero's story deserves to be heard, and every act of service deserves our gratitude and respect.